Man, I hope this works. I don't know if it's gonna work or not. This is experimental. This is an experimental film. That's what we call an experimental film.
As long as they might be giants are playing in the background.
Wow, okay. You totally just undercut my intro voice in my head. Welcome to the Halloween episode, if you can call it that. I have Mr. RecklessLink starring as the voice inside my head, and now he's in yours too, so you're welcome for that. Um, Today we're going to be talking about games that are spooky and spooky that are games. Because, like, I think Reckless and I both have this fascination with horror as a genre. Um, I, I particularly, I mean, I like horror, but man, I cannot watch horror movies, most of them. I'm not great with like the gross out imagery and the scary exaggerated figures and images, but I am absolutely fascinated by horror as a fictional genre, um, and I believe that Reckless is he also has a similar story to mine. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I love horror as a genre. Games were my first foray into the horror genre. I like some horror films, but there are some that I can't do. Here's looking at you, Saw. I'm
Yeah,
not squeamish, but there's something about the way that they use their their ways that really bothers me.
yeah,
So there's that.
yeah. I had a bad experience with The Exorcist as a kid, and that was not, you know. So
Oh, that's a classic though, but I can definitely understand how that could be like traumatizing for a child. It's yeah.
no, I did. I have I not told you the story about how in the eighth grade I was done one of my assignments early, so the teacher brought me up to do this maze he found on the internet
No, I've never heard this
in
story.
front of the whole class. Look,
Do tell.
I almost had that maze too. I was a really smart cookie in the eighth grade, so I'd finished my English assignment faster than pretty much anybody else. So the teacher's like, "Come here, let me you know do this maze." You've never heard, so so you don't know about these mazes, do you?
I don't think so. No.
It was a big thing way back when. What was this? Was like fucking 2005 or 6 probably. Probably 2006. No, I don't know when it was exactly. One of those years. Um, but it used to be this maze, and it was just a simple maze. It was like a block. You were a square, and the maze got like it wasn't even really a maze. It was just a pathway, and you had to not touch the sides. And of course, to finish the maze, you had to go in a completely straight line. Um, and if you touch the sides, guess what happens? The fucking
You get
girl's
spooked.
the fucking girl's face shows up on the screen. And I swear to God, I did not touch the side. I was on the home stretch. So I almost made it. And then that
Oh,
happened.
those mazes. The
Those
flash game
mazes.
mazes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
those mazes. I was about to say, how did you live and not know what those mazes are?
I played a prank on one of my friends with one of those. I know
Oh
what you're
my
talking about
God.
now.
No, well, it happened to me in front of my eighth grade English class. So,
That's horrible. I
that
would
is,
never do that.
that is a bit horrible.
I prefer you to be on your own when
Yeah.
you get spooked by one of my pranks.
Yeah. I think everyone else in the class got spooked, but I like tried to escape the chair. Let's phrase it that way. Um, but yeah, and I was never really good with them. I don't know what the deal was. I never liked going into those haunted houses or anything like that. But I absolutely cannot resist reading the summary of a good horror film on Wikipedia. Um, so there's that. But video games are a special case, because video games and movies are very different mediums, and in a lot of ways, video games are excellent for horror and for creating horror. Um, the reason there is obvious is that it's actually happening to you. So if you get spooked, then it's not somebody in the film. You can't really detach yourself as much from it. Um, it's you. That's you. That's your fault that you got the spook. Um, so uh, I sort of came up with this question: what makes video games scary? What makes a really great scary video game, and how can you create uh, a game that is consistently scary and spooky every single time you play it? And I pitched this question to my good friend Reckless Link, and we're going to discuss it today using a few examples of how games scare us and maybe what we can do to discuss the genre of horror as it pertains to video games as a whole. Um, so I think we both kind of have a little list about elements that make games scary and spooky. And how about you give us a first point?
Oh, me.
Yeah,
Okay.
go ahead.
Um, where do I even start?
At the
Okay,
top.
well, I'll start with the first real horror game I played was the original Resident Evil. Bad voice acting and all, even though back then we didn't think it was that bad. But that's a different story entirely. We would, my friends and I, it was summer camp and we had a PlayStation and they let us go. It was in the junior high building and they let us go because we were in junior high. Let us have this whole like little back hallway section to ourselves. So we dim the lights and play games. And we decided because a friend brought a whole bunch of games that we would just pick what was next. And next was Resident Evil. None of us had ever played it, so we took turns. So when somebody would die, the controller would go to somebody else. And I'd never really. The only horror I'd seen before that was when I was flipping through the channels and accidentally stopped on the Child's Play movie, not knowing what it was, and then freaked myself the fuck out as an 8-year-old. But so Resident Evil was something very new, and it was very spooky to me back then. It had a lot of great mostly like what Resident Evil does well is its creatures and how they interact with the environment. Like the environment itself, like the mansion for the original Resident Evil, is scary in and of itself. But all these fucking weird ass creatures that are lurking around do the job of kind of scaring for you. Like they kind of invented the jump scare, I guess.
Oh yeah, the dog. Man, boy, do I hate me some Resident Evil dogs.
The dogs, the freaking if you played the HD remaster of RE1, the Crimson Heads, dear God.
Yeah.
The first time I ran into one of those, I about crap myself. It caught me pretty good.
Yeah, I think the
Uh,
Crimson Heads were a very interesting addition because they sort of they added that feeling of you not being safe, you know.
right. You're very much not in control.
But I think, and that's actually one of the points I want to talk about with regarding Resident Evil One. I think its control scheme and sort of the resources it gives you, the way the game is designed, and the way it's laid out, is part of it that makes you feel very unsafe. Just because if you encounter a zombie, it's like you don't have a whole lot of options. It's pretty much always in a corridor where you have to get it exact if you're going to try and run by the thing. But if you're going to stop and fight it, you really got to use them bullets, and you really don't have a whole lot of other options. And as the enemies get tougher, I think that's what keeps the scares sort of high.
Yeah, it's the fear of the unexpected, big time.
Yeah, I think the first Resident Evil is definitely is a pretty good example of that, and it's still pretty spooky if you play it today. Um, I think in some ways it isn't, just because of the history. Control schemes have gotten better and all that stuff. But I think the control scheme itself, those weird ass tank controls. I actually tried playing the game on the Wii, which is the remastered version, recently, and oh my god, I could not get used to those controls. I like kissed the wall so much. Because it's like if you're used to just all right, I'm going straight. There you go, and it's like. But I think that's one of the things that does make it kind of spooky is that you have to sort of adjust to these controls, and I think the controls are something that are important um, in scary video games and in creating horror. Um, and I think a lot of games try to take that control away from you, and I sort of wonder if that's maybe a good way to go.
I mean, I think you're right. Limiting the player is a good way to induce that fear. Um, for example, and I'm going to use this game series a lot in my examples, but Fatal Frame, you're very limited in scope of what you can do. You can walk, you can run, you can interact with things, but the only real way to defend yourself is with a magical camera. You have to take pictures of the spooks to defend yourself. And aside from that, you have a flashlight. So you have a flashlight and a camera. And by the way, what to take a picture, you go into first person mode, which means the ghosts are right in your fucking face, and it is horrifying. Like the atmosphere in those games is something I could never recreate in my wildest dreams. It is so good. All the little creaks and sound effects you hear as you're trying to get through, like I know in the first game it's a mansion, in the second game it's a village. All the little creaks and all the sound effects, and like there's no music except for some very mild ambiance that kind of like vibrates throughout. So when, like, something happens, it happens, and it's always in your face. Like
Right.
Resident Evil may have like invented kind of the jump scare, but Fatal Frame perfected it so well. To this day, those Fatal Frame 1 and 2, because it's only two I played, are probably still the two scariest games ever created for me.
So the Fatal Frame games. I've never actually played them myself. I've seen like a little bit of one of them. Um, is that a game series where if you go through it and you know it, does it is it still scary after that?
100%. I streamed Fatal Frame 1 like 5 years ago,
Yeah.
and I knew a good portion of the game, and it was still, like, there were parts that were legitimately still unnerving to get through, even though I knew things were coming. But it's kind of because it does utilize the system, like, in game. It, so the way that this works, the in-game clock has a side effect. There are hauntings that go on throughout these places, and they only happen at certain times in game. So you could be going through a room or an area in your first playthrough and nothing happens, but in the second playthrough, a whole lot of shit is going to start happening because you're going there at a certain time. So it has a way of making each playthrough a bit unique and still unnerving.
That is cool. Because I think one of the things that wears out some scary video games welcome is just that once you know what's going to happen, it kind of stops being scary. Um, and one of the examples I wanted to talk about with regards to that is Resident Evil 7. Um, I played it when it came out. My friend basically put me up to playing it, and he was like, "I can't wait to see your reactions," because he knows I don't do very well with scary stuff. Um, I played basically what consists of the prologue. God, what did it take? It took me an exorbitant amount of time to get through it because I would stop and pore over every detail, which is what I do. I wish I had streamed and or recorded that because it would have been hilarious. But I think one of the things about Resident Evil 7 is if I went back and played it today, you kind of know what's coming. I mean, I wouldn't remember every detail, but I don't think that every time, Mia runs up and grabs you would be anywhere near as scary now as it was the first time. And I really think that that novelty sort of wears off, um, once you've gone through it. But, for a first timer, especially one who doesn't know what they're getting themselves into, I do think that Resident Evil 7 is effectively scary. I don't know how much you know about that particular one. Um, but I
I've
know
never
yeah.
I've never finished it. I did play it in VR with my roommate's brother back when it first came out because he had it,
Mhm.
and I don't know how far I got, like maybe 8 hours into it, and I I preferred, like, I wanted the VR experience because I know that that's like the true way to experience that game,
Oh,
and
I'm
I'm glad
sure.
I did because I mean, yeah, the imagery was scary. There was a lot of good jump scares and stuff, but I think that forcing it into that perspective made it even worse in some areas. Like, I'm not really a super jumpy person when it comes to these. Like, I've got a pretty good resolve, but I will admit that I was pretty unnerved and out of my element
Oh yeah.
for a good portion of that first playthrough before I kind of got used to it. And that's the best way to be, like, when you're playing those games.
Yeah.
Like, you need to be in the dark. You need to fully immerse yourself into it.
No, I played it in the middle of the day. No thanks. But no, I think there was one particular sequence that I thought was interesting in that game. I don't know if you'll remember it or not. You probably got to it being 8 hours in. And I was actually murmuring about it when right before we started was it's this part where you have to go get the D series arm in order to create the antidote or whatever to whatever's going on. Um, that part was that like at that point my friend was playing the game and he was blind on it and we were both freaked out because what happens is you go through this I think it's almost like a separate building. I'm not sure exactly where it is geographically in the game, but the best part about it is that it manages to scare you and nothing happens. You just go through this portion of the game where there really are no enemies and it just kind of keeps getting mildly spookier as you go along until eventually it corrals you into this like you have to crawl through a hole to get to another part of the room where the arm actually is. So you're trapped in there. So once you are, it's sort of like they can do whatever they want to you, and it is really creepy. I think one of the most subtly frightening images from that game is when after you get the arm, you turn around to look at the hole where you came in, and there's just a pair of feet there, and you're like, I'm stuck here. Yeah, I'm stuck. That's it. I have to face my whatever this is, and I have no choice. So I think that was actually a really interesting sequence, and they really didn't, especially after that point. I think that was the point where the game stopped being scary after that and started being Saw. But yeah, I mean, Resident Evil 7 is an interesting case to me because everyone was raving about it when it came out, and I don't know that it would be as effective, on a second playthrough. I've thought about going back and playing it, but um, it kind of leads me to another element of horror games that I think is very prevalent, and I think that pretty much every horror game uses this element, and that is stress. Um, Even the not scary horror games, I think, use stress as a major uh, thing to scare and unnerve the player. And I think my biggest uh, example of this is the Five Nights at Freddy's series, which I'm sure you'll bemoan.
I mean, I'm not the biggest fan of the gameplay, but I love the lore, and I think it did accomplish a very unique take on horror that I am okay with.
Yeah, that first game is really is impressive. Like you see it on on a surface level, and like it's really it's like wow, okay, this is really neat. And then you realize it's a bunch of JPEGs and GIFs, and then you realize it's a bunch of JPEGs and GIFs turned into an actual game, and then it becomes impressive again. Um, I mean, I think the thing that I don't like about it is that the jump scares are completely obnoxious. And anyone who reviewed the game used the jump scares that were completely obnoxious. And it's like if I could get the option to maybe turn those down a bit, then the game might be playable.
Yeah, they definitely. It's hard to describe, but they have their way.
But that game is pure stress. I mean, it purely preys on okay, I have to multitask. This game is all about multitasking. I have to check the cameras, check the doors, check the lights, look away from things that are about to kill me so that they don't, um, and it's interesting because it's definitely a mechanic that got remixed in every subsequent iteration, but they all prey on the idea of you being stressed, of you having to manage all of these different things. And I think that's what makes it interesting in addition to, what it uses to create its horror. Do you have I know
I
it's not something we really talked about beforehand, but is how do you feel about those?
I mean, no, stress is very important
Yeah.
in horror. I definitely agree. And I'll use Fatal Frame as an example again because it's so goddamn good. It uses stress as a mechanic, but in an entirely different way. Because again, you're one small person who only has two things on their person: the flashlight and the camera. I mean, you pick up random things around the house. It's a puzzle game, but because of how they use the haunts and the spirits that lurk in these places, there's always this huge sense of stress and dread because you never know what's going to be around any given There's a hallway I hate so much in the original Fatal Frame. It is like one of the scariest places for me because 9 times out of 10, it's this little winding staircase. You would on one set, turn to the left, and then turn to the left again, and there's another set of staircase in a small hallway. 9 times out of 10, there's nothing there. Once you get to a certain other part of the game, there's shit there, but because of the time mechanic, it doesn't always appear, so you're constantly going to be dreading going down that hallway, especially because there's a pretty good chance that one of the spirits is going to appear, and she's probably the most horrifying spirit in any of the Fatal Frame games. People who have played it only refer to her as the broken neck bitch for good reason.
Run! She's a ghost and a bitch.
Basically, she comes at you walking backwards because her neck is broken, like snapped, and it's like dangling like her back shoulders, and it's the most horrifying thing because that shit will come around the corner before you're all the way there and get right in your face. It's horrible.
Nearly
But you're
headless.
always stressed out because you're always in these places. You have to crawl through these small little like not like ducts, but these little crawl spaces and things like that. And there's always something that you're sure is there that might not always be because of its mechanic, and it's very very stress inducing.
That's actually pretty good because, like, I don't know. I mean, I didn't know a whole lot about Fatal Frame, but it's like that sounded to me more like the conclusion I want to reach is in how to make a game scary. Because if it's predictable, it can't be scary on subsequent playthroughs. But it sounds like Fatal Frame really nails that. But yeah, I think stress is definitely a big factor. I mean, it's one of the it's the main way that a game like Resident Evil 4 scares you. Um, it's dread. Dread's a good word. You know, I get to the castle in Resident Evil 4 and I'm like dread because it's like every single one of those rooms it sends you through is stressful and is potentially going to put you in a really bad situation. Um, so I yeah, dread's a good word. And I think a lot of scary games or games that try to be scary really do the dread well. You know, whether it's something following you, a lot of games do that, or you know, um, or just the fact that you know you have a limited amount of resources and you can't really, you know, you really have to pick and choose what you use.
Yeah, no Dread. Whew, where to begin? Dread. I like. This is gonna sound weird. I've played a lot of horror games and I like horror, and I actually love it if a game pulls me into that mindset where I'm full of dread and anxiety. 'Cause I think it's doing its job when it does that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'll pull a different example now. Silent Hill 4 uh, takes place in an apartment building, literally, in your apartment in an apartment building. There's a small little murder mystery going on, otherworldly murder mystery type deal going on, where you're predominantly in first person mode in your apartment building, and then once like a hell's portal opens up in your bathroom, you use that to get to other places in the game, which take place in the person perspective. But the apartment starts out, you're locked in your apartment, the door is chained, and you cannot get out, and people on the outside can't hear you knocking and begging to be let out. And it's supposed to be meant as this quote unquote safe zone where all these other places you go through this portal are very dangerous, full of grotesque, ugly creatures and imagery and ghosts. And then you'll get a small way into the game and you realize that your apartment building is not the safe zone you thought it was, because if you don't, there's certain things you have to do. If you don't utilize these items properly, your safe zone becomes haunted. And there's a lot of different hauntings that can happen, and they're all very unnerving. Like, you'll walk out and you'll hear the static from like the TV, and you'll go and interact with the TV and realize it's not plugged in. Like, it uses those old tropes throughout, and then other times you'll walk out, you'll hear a noise, and there'll be a fucking ghost like parsing his way through your wall. And the ghosts in this game are all like bloodied and look horrifying. It's really an interesting take. And while it's not like everybody's favorite Silent Hill, I love it for what it did bring, and I wish other games would like take from that, because it does a lot of interesting things.
Hmm. Yeah, I know you're a big fan of the Silent Hill franchise, and I've even watched a couple of videos on them myself. Um, wow, that makes me sound terrible. Oh, I've watched a couple of videos. I'm definitely the expert. Um, but yeah, I think Silent Hill is pretty interesting. But I think one of the things I admire about Silent Hill is it seems like it always has the ability to tell a really good story. I know two and three did a really good job of that because it like sort of profiled the main character psychologically.
Yeah, Silent Hill 2 is one of my favorite games of all time, and it's definitely my favorite Silent Hill. I don't know if I would call it my favorite horror game, but it's definitely way up there because it paints itself so innocently at first. You know, I'm blanking on the character's name for no real reason. But you're starting out as this guy who gets a letter from his dead wife to go back to Silent Hill, and then it devolves into this psychological torture and him remembering how things really happened and him dealing with his regret for how the events transpired. And it's very brilliantly written.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of good things. That's a super eye patch wolf thing. He did a video on Silent Hill 2 that was really good. Um, and actually, go watch Super Eye Patch Wolf's video on a lot of things horror. He's done videos on Silent Hill and The Shining and Junji Ito stuff that got me into that. So go watch him. But yeah, no, Silent Hill is another good example. It definitely seems like it's way up there with sort of the Resident Evil and the Fatal Frame. I feel like Silent Hill is kind of like those two put together. Is that kind of like a?
I mean, kind of.
Yeah.
I always put Fatal Frame at the top, and Silent Hill's kind of the secondary. And like, there's some other series that flirt with the third spot, like Resident Evil and oh god, what's that other one? Oh god, I can't remember what it's called. But you play as a detective, and the horror comes. I'm not even going to get into explaining that game, but I put that kind of up there because of the way it I don't know. It's better than some of the Resident Evil games, but there are Resident Evil games that I feel are better than that. It's weird. Anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. So another thing I'm going to talk about is sort of like the unintentional horror genre. And I think this goes along with something you might discuss as atmosphere. Um, Maybe people don't consider this a scary game, but how about Majora's Mask?
Oh, Majora's Mask is very dark. There's a lot of like creepy imagery, but I think because it's painted over with that friendly Zelda paint, that it kind of downplays some of it.
Yeah, and I think it's almost its sort of cartoony charm that gives it its impact. You know, the fact that oh yes, the game is very colorful, and then the moon is just terrifying all the time.
One of the
It's
scariest parts when I remember when I first played it that really jumped out at me is when Link is being um, cursed into his Deku form. That whole scene where he's just like he realizes a Deku and he's just shaking in horror like that. It's like
yeah,
what?
yeah. The whole game really does a good job of it. It's like definitely a game you can play at Halloween and still get away with it because again, it uses that concept of stress because the 3 day thing always stresses me the heck out because if I don't get what I got to get done, it's like I got to start it over again. Um, you know, the themes are dark. The imagery is pretty freaking scary. Anytime Link transforms with a mask for the first time, yeah, prepare for the spooks. Those faces are not great. They
I
just
mean,
aren't.
the Goron one's laughable, but the others are
Yeah,
pretty.
I mean the Zora looks like a friggin' demon.
Yeah, he does.
Um, so yeah, I mean I think Majora's Mask is a very interesting case of that. Um, and all of its areas are sort of a little bit more dreary than Ocarina of Time. And even Ocarina of Time has its moments. I mean, I think a lot of people are gonna, you know, would talk about their first experience with Dead Hand, you know, as
Oh, good old Dead Hand.
as being a lovely moment where they realize video games were also scary.
It's one of the first times that a game made me cuss. I remember that.
Oh yeah. Oh, I was not okay with Dead Hand. I was like, no
I was
thanks.
more. I played it with my roommate. This is back when we were in like junior high. When did that game came out? 98. Yeah, junior high. And I remember he was in control because I hadn't had a chance to play it yet, and he got to that part. And my reaction was like, "Whoa, what? What the fuck is that thing?
Yeah, no,
Excuse me?"
because it's sort of like otherworldly, and I think one of the things that makes Zelda interesting is that it forces you to look at it. Like I know Fatal Frame does this too because the main thing that you use is a camera. But I think in a lot of horror games it's like let me maybe make me not look at that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like but I think in Ocarina of Time it's like it really because you have to get captured by its hand, you know, it's like you got to deal with it for a little while and it's like I don't want to deal with it for a little while.
Yeah.
You know, so I think it's interesting when a game sort of forces you to do that. I mean, the way that it holds you, and then it's coming closer and closer, and you gotta figure out a way to get out of it. I mean, it's not, you know, again, it's not a horror game thing, but it's definitely something memorable that you know you'll remember having the crap scared out of you as a child from. And I think Majora's Mask is probably worse with that because there's so many bad things going on in that game. And then there's just
There's
the existential horror of Majora's Mask, the idea that you can't save everyone in a single run through. You need several cycles of 3 days in order to make things completely right. Like that's, I don't know. I think as a video game, that's expressly bleak outlook.
I think mechanically speaking, Majora's Mask is one of the most brilliant games in the Zelda series because of what it did to create its tension and to create, its sense of urgency and you getting all these things done. And I know that Breath of the Wild kind of brought that time mechanic back where characters had schedules and things like that. But for me, like the sense of urgency that Majora's Mask puts you into is like second to none in that franchise.
Right.
Like you have to get shit done. You have to keep moving.
Yeah, there's really not a whole lot of dicking around in that game.
And I'll go back on Ocarina of Time for a second. There's another. I remember it. I wasn't scared by it, but I was definitely a bit unnerved because I never expected a Zelda game to do this kind of thing. Like the first time you become an adult and you leave the Temple of Time and go out into Hyrule Castletown proper, and there's just
No thanks.
fucking Redeads everywhere, and it's all purple and just destroyed and grotesque, and you're like, what?
Yeah, I did not want to play the game anymore. I was like, make it go back to being happy, please.
Yeah. I remember my younger brother was watching me play at this point. I just kind of walked in there, and he's very fearless. And I walked through there, and I was slightly uncomfortable. I was like, what? I didn't realize that Redads weren't zombies at the time. I don't think anybody did. I was like, there are literal zombies everywhere. And I feel guilty for cutting them down because they could be townspeople. Like, why is this game doing this to me?
Right.
It's cool, but what the hell?
Yeah, no. I mean, I think that's definitely the implication. I think that pretty much everyone assumes that the Redads are just townspeople. And I think that's definitely something too. It tells a story, right? And this is one of those things that I get fascinated with, especially in horror games, because I want to stop and look at everything and sort of try to imagine how things were prior to spooks going down. And I think that a lot of the times, that sort of context is lost in horror games because they just have to start with the gross and decaying sort of scary things. But I think sometimes it can be scarier if you know what the place was like beforehand. And Ocarina of Time does that. That's one of the reasons why the market is like so jarring to walk into the first time, because you're like, whoa, wait a second, this ain't right. Because you know what it looked like before, you know what it was supposed to be like. I mean, I always imagine sort of a masquerade ball. The castle in Resident Evil 4 is a good one, where it's like I like to imagine people in all the rooms. You were there for the stream too, where I wanted to go through and like talk about all the pictures and the history. Places like that are
giving lore to the paintings. It was super interesting.
Places like that are fascinating. The baker, not the baker. Is it the baker? The baker estate from Resident Evil 7. That's a house with history, man. I mean, it's like, and there actually was a DLC to that game that did that. What was it? Sisters or something, and it completely derailed the lore of the game, which was, don't do that. But I think that sometimes catching those glimpses of normalcy is what makes a game's scarier moments all the more scary. I mean, look at the piano from Mario 64. Like that shit's jarring.
That was the jump scare. I wasn't really like afraid of the piano.
Right.
I just never expected a piano to come alive and try to bite Mario's butt off.
Right.
And he's trying to grab that red coin.
Yeah.
But, yeah. So, yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I think that's something Resident Evil 1 and 2 do really well. Like, Resident Evil 1 takes place in the Spencer Mansion, and there's a lot of lore, a lot of underlying lore that you can pick up as you're going through and reading, not just reading diaries, but just looking through the rooms. And it's all interweaved into the story, which makes it that much scarier. And with Resident Evil 2, it takes place mainly in the police station.
Yeah.
And it's the same kind of thing. There's a lot of lore and a lot of things going on that's all kind of interweaved in the story. It does a good job of kind of getting you to feel that lore. That makes sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the lore's the fun part. It's interesting that horror tends to have a lot of lore. Because I think that sometimes what makes things scarier is when they're not explained. And to branch away from video games for a moment, I think that's something that Junji Ito manga does really well. It gives you the scary thing. The scary thing either gets the protagonist or doesn't, and that's it. You don't have any idea what. You don't have any idea why the thing is there, how it got created, what's it doing, what's the goal. I think games explain things a lot. Um, and I think that sometimes maybe that's, to its detriment. Um, but I love the lore. Of course, I love the lore. I love reading about all the things that make that world tick. But yeah, I think it's also always worth looking into. How were things before? How did things develop? Was this a good? Is this a tragic place? Or is it? You know, has it always been sort of this den of evil? So um, I don't know. I like that sort of thing. Um, and I think that sometimes, you know, it can make a game scarier. And I've always wondered, maybe a game that sort of recreates itself every time you play um, is one that could be scary because you don't know what to expect. Or maybe you do, or you think you do, and then you don't. Kind of like what you were saying with the Fatal Frame thing.
Yeah, no, it can really play with your emotions that way,
Yeah.
and I like it. I like if I'm going to be immersed in a horror game, I want it to constantly force me into different perspectives like that, because that's how I know it's doing its job.
Right. And I think there's like one more game that I want to talk about here that I think actually does horror pretty well in its moments. And I think it kind of ties in with a lot of the themes that we've been talking about. And that's Minecraft. You know, you go around, you see a lot of screaming videos about things that happened in Minecraft. Um, and it's interesting because a lot of the times, like people say Minecraft is like this relaxing game, and I believe that. But I feel like it can also be a very stressful and kind of scary game.
I agree. Like, especially if you're, in a deep, dank cave going on a little spelunk run, there's a lot of things, like, especially if you're a headphones user, that you'll start to pick up on. Like, you'll hear these zombie moans. But what always does it for me is if you're tunneling and you can fucking hear that lava, but you can't exactly pinpoint where it is, that is like the most nerve wracking thing. Because if it's above you, you decide to dig up and take a peek, you're probably going to die unless you're quick. The reflexes.
Right. I think one of the things that makes Minecraft such a brilliant game, and one that also makes it very scary, is that you control the pace. Temptation is a huge part of Minecraft and its appeal, and also what makes it very nerve wracking. Because again, you set the pace. You go down into the earth on one of your mining expeditions. You expect to get something out of it, and when you get something, you want more of it. Like Minecraft really makes you greedy, and it's like, all right, so I found some diamond. You don't go back up into the thing and just save it. You want to go deeper. You want to find more. You want to explore these caves, and they're full of danger. And the deeper you go, the more likely you are to A, get lost on the way out, or B, run into trouble that you really can't get out of. And I think that's one of the things that makes it unnerving. And even when, for example, um, even when you're just first starting out, you're building a shelter or whatever, you know, you're stuck at night. You can't do anything because you'll die. You'll get accosted by monsters and you'll inevitably get bopped. Um, so it's a bit of a scary thing. And even when you have built things, when it's dark, it's a coin toss whether or not something's going to show up in your space unless you light the place up with torches, which is not always aesthetically pleasing. Um, but I mean, I think you know Minecraft's simplistic nature is another thing that sort of makes it scary, creepy because it's otherwise very colorful and very peaceful, but at night it's a very different story. And it's one that is devoid of lore, devoid of traditionally spooky imagery, you know? Um, I think I think it's a fascinating case of a game that can be terrifying and can elicit the same sort of screams that a horror game can. Decent point.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything you said.
So I almost wonder, almost taking cues from Minecraft, how could you apply that to a horror game? You know, um, sort of maybe creating a false sense of security. Because again, I feel like the biggest thing about I can I can hear that pretty good, you know.
Oh, sorry.
um, I think one of the again the big thing that goes along with video games is control, and the fact that the scary things happen directly to you. So I mean, to create horror, what do you do? Do you limit what the player can do? Do you do you make them make choices in the moment, or do I'm always thinking about like what could you make scary to a player, you know? And I think we've talked about all the things that a lot of the games a lot of games do successfully. What are some elements that you think maybe they could, haven't been touched on as much in horror games that could create scares?
That's an interesting thought. I've never really thought about that. Um, I don't know. I've played a lot of different horror games, and they all have their own way of being, as far as that's concerned. So I'd have to devote more time to think on something like that to have a definite answer. I'm sure you have one, but I haven't really thought about that. That's an interesting train of thought, though.
Yeah, because again, I think a lot of horror games sort of lose their, they sort of lose their luster. And again, I think something like a randomization is is a good feeling. Um, and certainly things that aren't explained, I think, is something that not a whole lot of video games touch on or use as sort of a central um, theme. I've been thinking lately too, like in this, about a game concept that I came up with a long time ago, and it would be that um, you're just a regular person, and the whole point of the game is for you to figure out how to like how you would survive the longest in a zombie apocalypse. So the game would start with you preparing for it. Um, and I think the scary part would be you don't know how much time you have. So you can allocate your time to sort of preparing, to maybe like building a fortress or stockpiling, weapons, or creating an escape plan or something. But you wouldn't necessarily know how much time you have, and you wouldn't necessarily know how things would start. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that procedural games like that, like almost in a more traditional gaming format, rather than trying to present a story, would be an interesting way to go about a horror game. Um, and just sort of testing the player and making sure that every iteration of the game is different. You know what I mean? And just
Yeah.
seeing and almost seeing like how far can you get, because I think a lot of that style of game has gone by the wayside. I think people a lot of the time like games with a beginning and an end, um, that is consistent and that can be discussed. But I think that
And a
randomly
horror game doesn't necessarily have to be either of those.
right, yeah, and I think that it's something that's kind of untapped. Like think about like a Minecraft but scary. You know what I mean? But like supposed to be scary. But
I'd be down.
so I think in a game like that you would always sort of know that something is coming. You don't know when, and you don't know exactly what form it could take. Maybe it could be like, as you would expect, a horde of zombies. Maybe it would be slowly, you would just see like a couple here and there, and the panic would sort of ensue, and it would be your story in that case would develop more as people are, maybe your neighbors are going crazy or something in that version, or maybe it's just there's one scary giant monster after you. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I don't know. I think that's maybe something that this genre could do. Have sort of like a multiple paths, randomly generated threat sort of thing. You know?
That would be interesting. I'd be down to play something like that for sure.
Yeah, I think it would, and I think definitely in this day and age where, we have YouTube to show us all the scary parts without actually putting ourselves in that shoes, in that danger. Um, I think that might actually be a pretty cool concept to revisit because years ago I didn't know anything about it, but I think it would actually be a cool idea.
I think so too. I hope that, and I agree that I think at least for the last maybe 5 years or so, horror has not been like the biggest thing in gaming. Like there hasn't really been a lot of really big, high-profile horror releases.
Right.
And I'd like to see more because it used to be something I would really look forward to.
Yeah, and I think it's a really good genre for video games to get into because it's one that's made so more effective when you're the one trying to make the decisions. Hell, I think even a game where there is more decision making could be really scary. Where it's like, yeah, you're stressed, but you also have to just just plain make decisions. You know what I mean?
I'd be interested to see something like that, like maybe something kind of like Heavy Rain or that type of game,
But like
but in
amped
a
up.
horror setting where your decisions are,
Yeah,
that would be interesting. I would definitely play that if it existed.
yeah. So, anyways, I think that's about where we're gonna end off. Did you have any other games you wanted to talk about, or any other elements that you think were are cool?
Um, I did have another game I wanted to bring up, but I don't know how to bring it up. But first, I missed something when I was talking about two other games we were talking about. The first one would be Silent Hill, specifically two. The way it handles its atmosphere and its horror is you start out in the town of Silent Hill, which is covered by this dense fog, which interestingly enough, the developers actually had CRT TVs in mind when building it because they use like the way that the CRT TVs project light to make the fog appear more dense and certain areas feel darker and more dank.
That's
It's pretty interesting.
that's cool.
And like you'll start out in the town and it's very silent. Sometimes you'll hear these noises of weird creatures in the distance. Then you'll eventually get to the first big area, which is an apartment building. So you'll go from being out in the world. It does this thematically throughout the game, but you'll go from the town, which is open and easier to navigate, and then into these really claustrophobic places like the apartment building, which is the first place you go in Silent Hill 2. All these tight corners and a lot of small rooms, and your flashlight only like they made it like a real ass flashlight where it will only illuminate certain areas, and then everything else you're not going to really see except for like bits and pieces of your character model.
Right.
So they really went the extra mile to make it feel well. For one, to make at least that part feel real, like how much you're able to see, and then to amp that up and to make it a living hell, basically.
Yeah, and I think the game design is something that you really got to appreciate in horror games because they have to use that. They have to use the level design and the space to enclose you and entrap you and make it scary. Um, and I think that that's something you really got to appreciate. A lot of games do have those tight corridors and those you know things that come together to make a place feel huge. Resident Evil 1, like we said earlier, does that expertly. It puts you in a corridor such that you have to really do a good job and know how zombies work to just straight up avoid them rather than have to fight them. And I know Silent Hill is that way, and a lot of horror games use that to their advantage. It's an interesting thing that's important in game design, but even more important in horror games. I feel.
Yeah, no, that's a like enemy design to me in games like that is paramount. Like if your horror game is going to have a series of grotesque creatures, then you've got to take them up as far as you can. And I think Silent Hill 3 wins in that department on so many levels because there are so many like fucked up, grotesque, like horrifying looking creatures in that game. And I remember the first time I played it, there was one section in particular that I absolutely hated because there's a lot. Not that there's a lot of creatures, but they're always placed just perfectly to where they're either hard to get around, or you were always going to run into them and have to look at them and be afraid of them again.
Mm.
That's not even getting into like Silent Hill 1 and 3 do this thing where they have different realms. You'll say you'll go through the hospital. Well, then once you've cleared out most of the hospital, you'll have to go to the hell version of the hospital. There's some sort of means. Usually, it's some sort of weird portal or something, or some event that triggers the hell version. Like you'll. I think the hospital. You look in this bathroom mirror, and it like mutates everything into the hell version. Where now everything is still dark and decrepit and spooky. Now there's this almost rusty blood color kind of everywhere.
Yeah.
Everything looks even more broken down than it did before, and the creatures are stronger. And it's like, God,
Right. Yeah, I think the dichotomy thing, that's another example of sort of like knowing what it looked like and then having a creepy version of it was cool. That also kind of reminds me of I always get these games mixed up, but it's one in the Trilby series of games.
oh man, yeah.
The one where he's in the hotel and you kind of switch back and forth between creepy. I love
I think
watching.
that's 7 Days a Stranger.
Is it? Yeah. Or
Yeah,
yeah. I think
6 Days a Stranger, something like that. I know what you're talking about.
actually no. I think it's Trilby's notes actually, because 7 days is on the spaceship and 6 days is in the bunker.
Oh, you're right. Trilby's Notes. Yeah, no, it.
Yeah.
Oh, that game's so good.
Yeah. I love watching those too because they're spooky and they're not like the imagery isn't what gets you about them. And I think that that's a cool thing about those is that they manage to be horror games without having to rely on really spooky graphics as a crutch. You know what I mean?
Yeah, like pixel horrors have a lot going for them.
Yeah.
And it's a genre I never saw myself getting into, but I really like them. There's several good examples, like the Trilby, and then the Strange Men series. We have like the Crooked Man, the Hanged Man, stuff like that.
Yeah, I'd like to see more of that. I think that's cool. I think limiting yourself in what you can do to create horror makes people get more creative as well. So I think that's
Have you seen The Witch's House? That's a pixel horror. It's not really. I mean, there's a lot of horrifying, like horror, like haunted house, spooky things going on, but they don't really present themselves as being scary. The scariest part of that game is the ending, which I don't want to spoil if you haven't seen it.
I haven't.
But oh my god, it might be one of the most fucked up things I've ever seen in a game.
Oh boy.
Actually, you should play that for Halloween. I would love to see it
Oh god.
because it wouldn't spook you out to the point of you don't want to play it.
Okay.
But
Well,
be warned, the ending is a thing, and oh god.
I'll consider it. So yeah, I just wanted to talk about that. This went on a little longer than I thought it would, but again, I could go on for even longer, of course.
So
But-
could I.
As I could with most things because it's definitely a fascinating thing. So maybe I don't know, one time we'll get together again and talk about other sides of that. It's a big topic. It really is. So yeah. But I think for now that's where we'll end off. And I just thought about doing something Halloweeny and it's vloggy and it's good. So
Mostly hollow,
mostly
not too much weenie.
not too much weenie now. Actually, when it comes to me, it's mostly weenie. I feel like, and that'll get that canon will be quoted in places, I'm sure. But yeah,
Maybe by me.
probably by you, because you're the only one that hears it right now. So, anyways, yeah, I just want to talk about that. If you watch this, thanks. It's also really long, so good job for getting through it. But yeah, scary games. What are some good ones? What are some things they do right, and what are some things that maybe make them not so right? Because I think that's something we didn't get to talk a whole lot about, but we talk about what makes a scary game unscary. I don't know.
Yeah, put your answers in the comment section below. I'd like to read this. I'd like to read
Yeah, well,
all what you have to say.
so we'll see about that. So, alrighty. Thanks for coming. Y'all have a good Halloween and fall and enjoy all the things and don't get too spooked and stuff. I still don't know how to end vlogs. I still don't know.
Have a good rest of your day, guys. Thanks for listening to us ramble about the spooks.
Thanks, Reckless. Thanks for ending that one for me.
You're welcome.
Bye.